It was another typical day at Los Angeles International Airport, bustling with travelers rushing to catch their flights. The sun was shining brightly outside, but inside Terminal 4, the atmosphere was a mix of excitement and stress. People dragged suitcases behind them, some clutching coffee cups while others juggled phones and boarding passes. Among the chaos stood Sarah Collins, a flight attendant who had spent over 10 years perfecting her craft. With her neatly pressed uniform and warm smile, she exuded calmness in an otherwise hectic environment. Sarah loved her job, not just because it allowed her to travel the world, but because she felt like she played a small yet vital role in making people's journeys smoother. Whether it was helping a nervous flyer feel more at ease or ensuring business travelers reached their destinations without hassle, she took pride in creating moments of comfort for passengers. Today, however, would prove to be unlike any other day in her career. The flight ahead was a red-eye from Los Angeles to New York City, one Sarah had worked countless times before. It was a popular route, often filled with celebrities, executives, and families traveling across the country. As usual, Sarah arrived early to prepare the cabin. She checked that all safety equipment was in place, ensured the first-class seats were immaculate, and stocked up on snacks and beverages. Once everything was ready, she joined her colleagues near the gate to greet passengers as they boarded. Boarding began smoothly enough. Businessmen in tailored suits walked briskly down the jet bridge, eager to settle into their plush leather seats. Families with sleepy children shuffled along, trying not to disturb those already seated. And then there were the occasional solo travelers, some reading books, others scrolling through their phones, who added a quiet rhythm to the process. Sarah greeted each passenger with her signature smile, offering polite hellos and assistance where needed. As the line dwindled, a man approached the entrance of the plane. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and a laid-back demeanor. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, he didn't quite fit the image most people associated with first-class travelers. Still, Sarah didn't think much of it. She'd seen plenty of wealthy individuals prefer comfort over formality. What caught her attention, though, was the way he carried himself. There was something carefree about him, almost as if he owned the place. "Good evening, sir," Sarah said cheerfully as he handed over his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard." "Thanks, sweetheart," he replied with a grin, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. "Looking forward to this ride." Sarah nodded politely and directed him toward the front of the plane. Little did she know, this seemingly ordinary interaction would set off a chain of events that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about her job and herself. Mark Sinclair, as he introduced himself when settling into his seat, seemed harmless at first glance. But within minutes of sitting down, his presence began to make waves. He stretched out across two seats using one armrest as a pillow and propping his feet up on the empty space beside him. His carry-on bag dangled precariously from the overhead compartment, threatening to fall at any moment. When a flight attendant asked him to stow it properly, he laughed it off, saying, "Relax, I've got it under control." But it wasn't just his disregard for basic airplane etiquette that drew attention. Mark was also talkative, very talkative. He struck up conversations with neighboring passengers, sharing stories about his life, cracking jokes, and offering unsolicited advice about everything from investing in stocks to choosing the best restaurants in New York. Some found his energy entertaining, but others grew visibly annoyed. A businessman typing furiously on his laptop shot him a glare after being interrupted multiple times. A young couple trying to nap exchanged frustrated glances as Mark's laughter echoed through the cabin. Sarah noticed the growing tension among the passengers. First class was supposed to be a haven of tranquility, a refuge from the cramped quarters of economy. Yet here was Mark, turning it into something closer to a comedy club, or worse, a chaotic living room. She decided it was time to step in. Walking over to his seat, Sarah smiled warmly and leaned down slightly so as not to appear confrontational. "Mr. Sinclair," she began, keeping her tone light and friendly, "I just wanted to remind you that we need to keep our belongings securely stowed and respect the personal space of other passengers. Would you mind adjusting your bag and maybe keeping your feet off the seats? Mark looked up at her, clearly surprised by the request. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond. Then with a chuckle he replied, "Sure thing, sweetheart. No problem." But instead of complying fully, he only half-heartedly moved his bag and kept his posture largely unchanged. Sarah sighed inwardly, sensing this wouldn't be the last conversation she'd have with him. Though she tried to remain patient, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's behavior was testing the limits of professionalism. As the minutes ticked by, she realized she might need to take more drastic action to restore peace in the cabin. Little did she know, doing so would lead to consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. Mark Sinclair wasn't a bad guy. In fact, he was quite the opposite, warm, friendly, and always ready with a joke or story to share. But life had taught him to live in the moment, to enjoy every opportunity that came his way. And today, that opportunity happened to be a first-class seat on a flight from Los Angeles to New York City. The ticket hadn't been purchased by him. It was a gift from his stepson, none other than Hollywood superstar Vin Diesel. To Mark, this wasn't just a flight. It was an experience, a chance to indulge in luxury and feel like royalty for a few hours. But Mark wasn't accustomed to flying first class. His usual mode of travel involved economy seats, where people were more forgiving of casual behavior. He didn't realize that first class came with its own set of unspoken rules. Keep your belongings neatly stowed, maintain a respectful distance from fellow passengers, and avoid drawing too much attention to yourself. These weren't things anyone had explicitly told him. They were expectations silently understood by those who frequented premium cabins. As Sarah walked away after her initial polite reminder, Mark shrugged off her request. She's just doing her job, he thought to herself. No harm done. But moments later, he found himself cracking another joke to the passenger seated next to him, a middle-aged woman who looked increasingly irritated. "You know," he said with a wink, "if I'd known how comfortable these seats were, I'd have asked Vin to book me one years ago." The woman forced a tight smile and turned her head toward the window, clearly hoping he'd take the hint. But Mark didn't. Instead, he leaned back further into his seat, spreading out even more. His carry-on bag remained precariously balanced in the overhead compartment, and his feet stayed firmly planted on the edge of the empty seat beside him. Passengers around him exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes discreetly while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah, watching from the galley, felt a knot forming in her stomach. She prided herself on creating a pleasant atmosphere for everyone on board, but Mark's antics were starting to disrupt the harmony of the cabin. First class was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where travelers could relax, work, or sleep without distractions. Yet here was Mark, turning it into something closer to a neighborhood block party. Determined to address the situation before it escalated further, Sarah approached him again. This time she spoke with a firmer tone, though still maintaining professionalism. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, leaning in slightly so as not to be overheard by nearby passengers, "I really need you to cooperate. Please move your bag properly into the overhead bin and try to keep your feet off the seats. We want to ensure everyone feels comfortable during the flight." Mark blinked at her, momentarily caught off guard by the seriousness in her voice. For a split second he considered arguing, or maybe making another lighthearted comment. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the earnestness in Sarah's expression, or perhaps it was the realization that he might actually be causing
trouble.
Whatever the reason, he hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, he muttered, swinging his legs down and adjusting his bag with exaggerated effort. "Happy now?" Sarah gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. I appreciate your understanding." For a brief moment, it seemed like the issue had been resolved. Mark settled back into his seat, and Sarah returned to her duties, relieved that the confrontation hadn't turned into a full-blown argument. But peace in the cabin was short-lived. Within minutes, Mark resumed his earlier behavior, albeit in a slightly toned-down manner. He struck up yet another conversation with the man sitting across the aisle, loudly discussing everything from sports teams to conspiracy theories. His laughter boomed through the otherwise quiet cabin, prompting several passengers to plug in, their earphones, or bury themselves deeper into their books. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to monitor the situation closely. She noticed the growing frustration among the other passengers. A businessman typing on his laptop shot Mark a sharp glance when interrupted mid-sentence. A young couple traveling together whispered nervously, clearly annoyed by the constant chatter. Even the flight crew began exchanging worried looks, wondering if they should intervene again. Feeling torn between her responsibility to enforce airline policies and her desire to avoid escalating tensions, Sarah decided to give Mark one final warning. Approaching him once more, she kept her voice low but firm. "Mr. Sinclair," she began, "I understand you're enjoying the flight, but we really need to maintain a certain level of decorum in this section. If you could please keep your conversations quieter and respect the personal space of those around you, I'd greatly appreciate it." This time Mark didn't respond with humor or charm. Instead, he frowned, looking genuinely puzzled. "What's the big deal?" he asked, his tone tinged with defensiveness. "I'm not hurting anyone. Isn't this supposed to be a relaxing flight?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how to explain the nuances of first-class etiquette without sounding condescending. "It is," she replied carefully. "But part of ensuring relaxation for everyone means following some basic guidelines. It's nothing personal. I just need to make sure all our passengers are comfortable." Mark stared at her for a moment, then sighed heavily. "Fine," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "If it makes you happy, I'll behave." Though his words sounded cooperative, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely convinced. And as she walked away, she braced herself for the possibility that this wouldn't be the end of the matter. Little did she know, her next decision would lead to consequences far greater than she ever anticipated. The tension in the cabin lingered, palpable yet unspoken. While Mark appeared to settle down, at least temporarily, the ripple effects of his behavior continued to spread. Nearby passengers remained on edge, glancing warily in his direction whenever he shifted in his seat or cleared his throat. Some even started asking flight attendants if they could switch seats, citing vague reasons like needing extra legroom or being closer to the restroom. Sarah, meanwhile, wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt justified in addressing Mark's disruptive actions. On the other, she couldn't ignore the nagging doubt creeping into her mind. Was she being too strict? Could there have been a better way to handle the situation without alienating him? These questions swirled in her thoughts as she moved through the cabin, attending to other passengers' needs. Back in his seat, Mark tried to suppress his irritation. He wasn't used to being reprimanded, especially not in such a public setting. Sure, he'd gotten carried away, but he hadn't intended to cause any real harm. All he wanted was to enjoy the flight, soak in the novelty of first-class luxury, and maybe entertain his fellow travelers along the way. Why was that such a problem? As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah made one last sweep of the cabin, double-checking that everyone was buckled in and ready. When she reached Mark's row, she offered him a polite nod, hoping to convey a sense of closure. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Sinclair," she said softly. "We'll do our best to make sure you have a pleasant flight." Mark gave her a curt nod in return, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, sure," he muttered under his breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, he added, "Let's see how long that lasts." Sarah caught the remark, but chose not to respond. Instead, she focused on completing her pre-flight checks, determined to put the incident behind her. For now. But deep down, she knew that Mark's presence would continue to loom large over the journey ahead. What neither of them realized, however, was that this encounter was only the beginning of a story neither could have predicted. The flight was now well underway, the hum of the engines filling the cabin as the plane soared through the night sky. Outside, the world below had faded into darkness, dotted only by the occasional glow of city lights. Inside, however, tensions remained high. Despite Mark's earlier promise to behave, his behavior hadn't improved much. He continued to sprawl in his seat, occasionally cracking jokes or humming loudly to himself. The businessman typing on his laptop had given up entirely, leaning back with a resigned expression while trying and failing to tune out the noise. A young woman seated nearby had donned noise-canceling headphones and buried her face in a book, clearly doing everything she could to avoid engaging with the situation. Sarah, who had been keeping a close eye on Mark from the galley, felt her patience wearing thin. She knew that as a flight attendant, it was her responsibility to maintain order and ensure the comfort of all passengers. Yet every time she approached Mark, he either brushed off her requests with a laugh or complied, just enough to seem cooperative before slipping back into his old habits. It was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. It kept slipping through no matter how hard she tried. As the hours passed, Sarah began to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Other passengers were growing increasingly restless, their frustration evident in the way they avoided eye contact with her, or muttered under their breath when passing by Mark's seat. One man even stopped her in the aisle to say, "I hope you're planning to do something about him. This is supposed to be first class, not a circus." His words stung, but they also reinforced what Sarah already knew. She couldn't let this continue unchecked. Taking a deep breath, she decided it was time for a more decisive approach. If polite reminders weren't working, then perhaps a firmer stance would get the message across. Steeling herself, she walked over to Mark's seat, once more. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I need to speak with you privately for a moment." Mark looked up at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's up?" he asked, his tone casual but tinged with curiosity. Sarah gestured toward the galley, hoping to have the conversation away from prying ears. Reluctantly, Mark unbuckled his seatbelt and followed her, though his body language suggested he wasn't particularly concerned about whatever she had to say. Once they were out of earshot of the other passengers, Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious. "Mr. Sinclair," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I've given you multiple opportunities to adjust your behavior, but unfortunately, things haven't improved. Your actions are causing significant discomfort for the other passengers, and I'm afraid I can't allow this to continue." Mark blinked at her, clearly taken aback. For a moment he simply stared, as if processing what she'd just said. Then his expression shifted from surprise to mild irritation. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "You're telling me I can't sit in my own seat because some people are too uptight to handle a little laughter?" "It's not about laughter," Sarah replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "It's about respecting the space and comfort of everyone on board. First class comes with certain expectations, and unfortunately your behavior hasn't aligned with those standards." Mark crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tightening. "So what exactly are you saying? You want me to leave my seat? Is that it?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that what she was about to suggest would escalate the situation further. But she also knew it might be the only way to restore peace in the cabin. "Yes, Mr. Sinclair," she said finally, her voice softening slightly. "I'm asking you to move to economy class for the remainder of the flight. It's nothing personal, but I believe it will help ensure a smoother journey for everyone involved." For a long moment, Mark didn't respond. He stood there, staring at her as if trying to decide whether she was joking or genuinely serious. Then slowly his lips curled into a wry smile. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "This is unbelievable. Fine. If that's how you want to play it, then sure, I'll move. But don't think I won't remember this." Sarah exhaled quietly, relieved that he hadn't put up more of a fight. "Thank you for understanding," she said, offering him a small apologetic smile. "We'll do our best to make your experience in economy as comfortable as possible." With that, Mark grabbed his carry-on bag from the overhead compartment and headed toward the back of the plane. As he passed through the curtain separating first class from economy, several passengers watched curiously, whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, while others seemed almost gleeful at the drama unfolding before them. Once Mark was settled in his new seat, a cramped spot near the rear lavatory, he leaned back and let out a heavy sigh. Part of him wanted to stay, angry, to stew in the indignity of being kicked out of first class. But another part of him couldn't help but find the situation absurdly funny. Here he was, the stepfather of one of Hollywood's biggest stars, reduced to sitting in economy because he'd cracked a few jokes and stretched out his legs. If Vin Diesel heard about this, he'd probably laugh until he cried. Meanwhile, back in first class, the atmosphere began to shift. Without Mark's boisterous energy dominating the cabin, the tension dissipated almost instantly. Passengers relaxed visibly, some even thanking Sarah for her handling of the situation. The businessman resumed typing on his laptop. The young woman lowered her book to glance out the window, and the couple traveling together exchanged relieved smiles. Yet despite the newfound calm, Sarah couldn't shake the unease lingering in the pit of her stomach. Asking a passenger to move classes wasn't something she did lightly, and she couldn't help but wonder if she'd made the right call. What if Mark decided to file a formal complaint? Or worse, what if his connection to Vin Diesel came back to haunt her? Her concerns deepened later in the flight when a nosy traveler approached her during beverage service. "Hey," the woman whispered conspiratorially, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "That guy you moved to economy. You know who he is?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, confused. "Who?" "He's Vin Diesel's stepdad," the woman said, her eyes widening dramatically, like the Vin Diesel, the actor. For a split second, Sarah froze, her mind racing. Vin Diesel, the global superstar known for his larger-than-life persona and fiercely loyal family ties? Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. Mark's easy confidence, his laid-back demeanor, and that cryptic comment about his stepson hearing about this. Her stomach dropped as the reality of the situation hit her full force. "Oh no," she murmured, barely audible over the hum of the engines. The nosy traveler nodded knowingly. "Yeah, I recognized him right away. You might want to brace yourself for whatever comes next." Sarah forced a weak smile, thanked the woman for the information, and quickly excused herself. As she retreated to the galley, her mind spun with questions. Had she just ruined her career over a single disruptive passenger? Would Vin Diesel himself intervene on behalf of his stepfather? And most importantly, how could she possibly fix this? Despite her growing anxiety, Sarah resolved to focus on finishing the flight professionally. She attended to the remaining needs of the passengers, refilling drinks and answering questions with practiced efficiency. But beneath her composed exterior, her thoughts churned relentlessly, replaying every interaction with Mark and wondering what consequences awaited her once the plane touched down. By the time the aircraft began its descent into New York City, the cabin was quiet, save for the gentle rustle of seatbelts being fastened and bags being retrieved from the overhead compartments. As passengers prepared to disembark, Sarah stole a glance toward the back of the plane, where Mark sat silently scrolling through his phone. He didn't look angry anymore. If anything, he seemed indifferent, as if the entire ordeal had slipped his mind. When the plane finally landed and the doors opened, Sarah braced herself for whatever might happen next. Would Mark storm off angrily, vowing revenge? Would he confront her directly, demanding answers? To her surprise, none of that happened. Instead, he simply gathered his belongings, stepped off the plane, and disappeared into the crowd without another word. Though the immediate crisis had passed, Sarah knew this wasn't the end of the story. Somewhere out there, Mark Sinclair was still out in the world, and so was his famous stepson. Whatever came next, she realized, would depend entirely on how fate chose to unfold. The days following the flight were a blur of anxiety for Sarah. Every time her phone buzzed, she jumped, half expecting to see an email from her supervisor or a scathing social media post about her handling of the situation. She even found herself Googling Vin Diesel's stepfather late at night, scrolling through articles and photos to confirm what the nosy passenger had whispered to her on the plane. Sure enough, there he was, Mark Sinclair, casually mentioned in interviews as Vin Diesel's beloved stepdad. The realization hit her like a freight train. She hadn't just removed some random disruptive traveler. She'd ejected the family member of one of Hollywood's biggest stars. At work, Sarah tried to act normal, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of what had happened. Her colleagues noticed her distracted demeanor and asked if everything was okay. She brushed them off with vague answers, saying she was just tired or stressed about her schedule. But inside, her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Mark filed a formal complaint? What if Vin Diesel himself got involved? Would this cost her job, or worse, tarnish her reputation? Despite her fears, nothing happened immediately. Days turned into weeks and life went on as usual. Passengers boarded and disembarked flights. Turbulence rattled the cabin occasionally, and Sarah continued her duties with the same professionalism she always had. Yet the memory of that fateful flight lingered in the back of her mind, a quiet reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. One evening, as Sarah scrolled through her inbox after a long day, she came across an unusual email. It was an invitation to a local charity gala hosted by none other than Vin Diesel. The subject line read, "Join us for a night of giving back." At first, she thought it must be spam or a mistake. Why would someone like Vin Diesel invite her, a regular flight attendant, to his event? But as she clicked open the email, she realized it was legitimate. Attached was a personalized note thanking her for her service and encouraging her attendance. Sarah stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Was this some kind of trap? A setup orchestrated by Mark to embarrass her in front of everyone? Or maybe it was Vin Diesel's way of addressing the incident indirectly, using the gala as a platform to air grievances about how his stepfather had been treated. Her imagination ran wild, painting vivid scenarios where she'd walk into the event only to face awkward confrontations or public shaming. But then again, what if it wasn't any of those things? What if it was simply a genuine gesture of goodwill? After all, celebrities often use their influence to bring attention to charitable causes, inviting people from all walks of life to participate. Maybe Sarah's name had been pulled randomly from a list of employees who had demonstrated dedication to their jobs. Still, the coincidence was hard to ignore. After much deliberation and several sleepless nights, Sarah decided to attend. If nothing else, it would give her a chance to clear the air, should she encounter Mark or Vin Diesel at the event. Plus, she reasoned, skipping such a high-profile gathering might look suspicious if anyone ever connected her absence to the flight incident. The night of the gala arrived and Sarah dressed carefully, choosing an elegant yet understated outfit that struck the perfect balance between professional and approachable. As she stepped into the grand ballroom where the event was being held, she felt both excitement and trepidation. The room was alive with energy, filled with well-dressed guests mingling over cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. Famous faces dotted the crowd, including actors, musicians, and philanthropists, all united for a good cause. Despite the glitz and glamour, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she didn't belong there. She wandered through the space, sipping champagne and trying to blend in while keeping an eye out for anyone remotely familiar. Then, near the bar, she spotted him. Mark Sinclair. He stood chatting animatedly with a group of guests, looking completely at ease in his surroundings. For a moment, Sarah considered turning around and leaving, but something stopped her. Summoning every ounce of courage, she approached him cautiously. "Mr. Sinclair," she said softly, tapping him lightly on the shoulder. Mark turned, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition. "Oh, hey," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "You're the flight attendant, right?" Sarah nodded, suddenly, feeling self-conscious. "Yes, that's me. I wanted to apologize for everything that happened on the flight. I never meant to cause you any trouble." To her astonishment, Mark laughed, not mockingly, but genuinely. "Don't worry about it," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Honestly, it was kind of funny. I probably deserved it." Relief washed over Sarah, though she still felt the need to explain herself. "I take my job very seriously, and I was just trying to make sure everyone on board felt comfortable. But looking back, maybe I could have handled things differently." Mark shook his head, smiling. "Nah, you did what you had to do. Besides," he added with a chuckle, "Vin thought the whole thing was hilarious when I told him. He said something like, 'That's karma for testing the rules.' So really, no harm done." Sarah blinked, momentarily stunned. "Wait, you told Vin Diesel about what happened?" "Of course," Mark replied, grinning. "Family talks about stuff like that. And trust me, he wasn't mad or anything. In fact, he thought it was pretty cool that I got moved to economy, said it reminded him of the early days before he made it big. Hearing this, Sarah couldn't help but laugh nervously. "Well, I'm glad he took it well. I was worried." "That I'd sick Vin on you?" Mark interrupted, raising an eyebrow playfully. "Nah, we don't roll like that. Look, I get it. You were doing your job. End of story." Their conversation continued, shifting from the flight incident to lighter topics. Mark shared stories about life as part of Vin Diesel's tight-knit family, describing the actor as fiercely loyal and deeply grounded despite his fame. He talked about attending movie premieres, meeting fans, and even helping Vin brainstorm ideas for films. Through it all, Sarah listened intently, fascinated by the glimpse into a world so different from her own. In return, she opened up about her experiences as a flight attendant, the challenges, the joys, and the occasional absurdity of dealing with passengers like him. Mark listened attentively, nodding along and occasionally chiming in with humorous anecdotes of his own. By the end of the evening, they parted ways as unlikely friends, each having gained a deeper appreciation for the other's perspective. As Sarah drove home later that night, she reflected on the surreal turn of events. What had started as a tense confrontation on a red-eye flight had somehow transformed into a meaningful connection. She realized that sometimes, the people we least expect to understand us can offer surprising grace and empathy. And though she doubted she'd cross paths with Mark again anytime soon, she knew she'd carry the lessons from their encounter with her forever. For now, though, she allowed herself a small smile. Against all odds, she'd survived the wrath of Vin Diesel's stepfather and come out the other side with a story worth telling. The gala had been an unforgettable experience for Sarah, one that left her feeling lighter and more at ease than she'd expected. Meeting Mark Sinclair in such a different setting, away from the confines of an airplane cabin, had humanized him in ways she hadn't anticipated. Gone was the image of the disruptive passenger who tested her patience. Instead, she saw a man with a warm heart, a quick wit, and a deep appreciation for family. Their conversation had shifted something inside her, not just about Mark but also about herself and how she approached difficult situations. Still, as the days passed and life returned to its usual rhythm, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what lasting impact their encounter might have. She replayed their exchange over and over in her mind, analyzing every word, every laugh, every moment of connection. Had Mark truly forgiven her? Or was he simply putting on a brave face? Was his assurance that Vin Diesel wasn't upset genuine? Or was there still a chance this could blow up in her face later? These questions lingered like shadows, refusing to fade completely. At work, Sarah threw herself into her duties with renewed focus. Each flight became an opportunity to practice patience, empathy, and professionalism, the very qualities she'd struggled with during her interaction with Mark. She began paying closer attention to the subtle cues passengers gave off. The businessman, tapping his fingers anxiously, the mother juggling a fussy toddler, the elderly couple holding hands quietly. Every person carried their own story, their own reasons for traveling, and Sarah made it her mission to acknowledge those stories without judgment. Yet despite her efforts to move forward, the memory of that night at the gala stayed with her. It wasn't just the relief of knowing Mark didn't hold a grudge. It was the realization that even seemingly small decisions could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Removing someone from first class wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about navigating human emotions, expectations, and relationships. And while she knew she'd acted within her responsibilities, she also understood now that there were nuances she hadn't fully considered at the time. One afternoon, as Sarah prepared for another red-eye flight, she found herself reflecting on the lessons she'd learned. The airline industry was unpredictable by nature, filled with countless variables beyond anyone's control. Weather delays, mechanical issues, and unruly passengers were all part of the job. But what made the difference, she realized, was how you responded to those challenges. Did you let frustration take over, or did you find a way to connect with people even when they pushed your buttons? As boarding began for the flight, Sarah greeted passengers with her usual warmth, though her thoughts kept drifting back to Mark. She wondered what he was doing at that very moment. Was he attending another glamorous event with Vin Diesel? or perhaps enjoying a quiet evening at home recounting tales of his misadventures on planes. Whatever it was, she hoped he was happy, and that their brief friendship had meant as much to him as it did to her. Midway through the flight, turbulence hit unexpectedly, shaking the plane and sending a wave of panic through the cabin. "Babies!" cried. Seatbelt signs flashed urgently, and nervous passengers gripped their armrests tightly. Sarah sprang into action, moving through the aisles with calm reassurance. "We're experiencing some bumps," she announced over the intercom, her voice steady and soothing. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. This will pass shortly." Her words seemed to settle the passengers somewhat, but one woman near the front remained visibly distressed. Clutching her chest, she looked up at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are we going to crash?" Sarah knelt beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "I promise we're safe," she said gently. "Turbulence is uncomfortable, but it's completely normal. Think of it like driving over a bumpy road. It feels scary, but the car doesn't break apart, right?" The woman nodded slowly, her breathing beginning to steady. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." In that moment, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for her training, for her ability to comfort others, and for the reminder that her role extended far beyond serving drinks or enforcing rules. She was there to be a calming presence, a source of stability in moments of uncertainty. And as the turbulence subsided and the cabin grew quiet once more, she realized that her encounter with Mark had taught her something invaluable. No matter how challenging a situation might seem, there was always room for understanding and compassion. When the flight landed safely in New York City, Sarah bid farewell to the passengers with her customary smile. As she walked through the terminal afterward, she noticed a magazine rack displaying the latest issue of a popular entertainment publication. On the cover was none other than Vin Diesel, flashing his signature grin alongside a headline about his upcoming film. For a fleeting second, Sarah hesitated, wondering if Mark had mentioned her name to him since the gala. Would Vin recognize her if their paths ever crossed? Would he remember the story of the flight attendant who'd moved his stepdad to economy? Shaking off the thought, Sarah reminded herself that it didn't really matter. What mattered was the growth she'd experienced because of that incident. She'd learned to see beyond surface-level behaviors, to approach conflicts with empathy rather than defensiveness, and to embrace the unpredictability of her job. Life, after all, was full of turbulence, literal and metaphorical, and sometimes the best thing you could do was buckle up and trust that everything would smooth out eventually. Back home later that week, Sarah decided to write down her reflections in a journal, a habit she'd picked up years ago but rarely kept up with. Flipping open the worn notebook, she scribbled a few lines about her recent experiences. "Sometimes the people who challenge us the most end up teaching us the biggest lessons. I never imagined I'd feel grateful to someone like Mark Sinclair, but here I am. He reminded me that everyone has a story, and sometimes those stories intersect in ways we least expect. Whether it's a celebrity stepfather causing chaos on a plane or a nervous flyer needing reassurance during turbulence, my job isn't just about following rules. It's about connecting with people. And maybe, just maybe, making their day a little brighter." Closing the journal, Sarah leaned back in her chair and exhaled deeply. She knew she'd carry these lessons with her for the rest of her career, and likely the rest of her life. Though she doubted she'd ever see Mark again, she felt a quiet sense of closure, knowing that their encounter had changed her for the better. As she drifted off to sleep that night, her last thought was of Mark's laughter echoing through the gala ballroom. It was a sound she'd never forget, a reminder that even in the most unlikely places, kindness and humor could bridge the widest gaps.